What if justice meant being turned into a lesson your bones shattered one by one as your village watched and cheered? What if your final moments weren't about guilt or innocence, but how loudly the crowd demanded your suffering? This wasn't a nightmare, this was real. For over 500 years, the breaking wheel wasn't just a punishment, it was a performance. Executions were public events, and pain wasn't a side effect. It was the goal. Behind every cracked rib and twisted limb was a belief that terror could keep order, and the scariest part, people didn't just accept it, they celebrated it. So what made a simple wooden wheel one of the most feared devices in history, and why did it take centuries to stop turning? What if your final breath came not with mercy but with the slow splintering of bone under iron? Your limbs twisted like vines around the spokes of a wooden wheel while a crowd gathered not to mourn but to cheer. What if your execution wasn't a sentence but a spectacle, an event people planned their day around? Children brought to learn about justice, vendors set up shop for, and priests blessed before the bones broke. This wasn't some gruesome legend whispered in the shadows of castles, it was real, state-sanctioned and terrifyingly popular across Europe for centuries. And it all revolved quite literally around a simple object, a wheel, a wooden, seemingly harmless wheel. It's hard to wrap our modern minds around it, isn't it? We think of punishment as something precise, confined, procedural. But in the world we're about to enter, justice wasn't just brutal, it was theatrical, and the wheel was its stage. To truly understand how the breaking wheel became one of the most feared torture devices in medieval history, we have to abandon everything we know about the rule of law, the presumption of innocence, and the basic dignity of the human body. We're stepping into a time when pain wasn't just a consequence, it was the point. But the wheel didn't start this way. It wasn't born of darkness. In its earliest form, it was used in ancient Greece and Rome for executioners, but often quickly, cleanly, but something changed. As Europe tumbled into the shadowy depths of the Middle Ages, the wheel wasn't just adopted, it was evolved. Medieval Europe didn't just use the wheel, it elevated it to an art form of agony. By the 13th century, this method of execution had spread like wildfire, embraced by monarchs, magistrates, and mobs alike. France loved it. The Holy Roman Empire adored it. And what's more chilling than its popularity was the philosophy behind it. That slow death wasn't just acceptable, it was righteous. In the twisted theology of medieval justice, suffering was purifying, pain was divine. If a man committed murder, it wasn't enough for him to die. He had to be dismantled physically and spiritually in front of everyone else, as a warning and a moral performance. The wheel delivered that spectacle with horrifying efficiency. Some called it the Catherine wheel, but let's be clear, Saint Catherine, according to legend, wasn't even killed by it. The story goes that the wheel broke when they tried to use it on her, a divine refusal to allow her torture. But for everyone else, the wheel rarely failed, and its message was consistent. Break the law, and we will break you, literally, now. Let's talk about the design, because this wasn't a slapdash instrument. This was calculated, engineering, brutal, precise, and horrifyingly effective. The standard wheel was about 6 feet in diameter. Victims weren't simply tied to it, they were arranged. Their bodies stretched across platforms or directly over the wheel, their arms and legs splayed like grotesque offerings to the crowd. Then came the executioner, not a thug, but a specialist. He didn't wield a sword. He carried a breaking bar, a heavy iron rod designed to shatter bones but not kill. Yes, you heard that right. Killing too quickly was considered a failure. The goal wasn't execution, it was demonstration, it was art. The first strikes were often to the limbs, arms, and legs, brought down upon with calibrated force, snapping bones like dry twigs. But the executioner had to be careful. Too hard, and death came too soon. Too soft, and the crowd grew restless. It was a performance, judged by pain, measured by moans, applauded by agony. Then came the next phase. The victim's broken limbs, now hanging at unnatural angles, were threaded through the spokes of the wheel, woven like some nightmarish tapestry of flesh and wood. Their body twisted, bent, contorted. And then the entire wheel, this horror. Sculpture was hoisted upright, mounted on a pole, turned into a living crucifixion that could be seen from afar. Some victims died in minutes from shock, blood loss, internal trauma, but others, they lasted hours, even days. Imagine that. Suspended in the air, broken in a dozen places, exposed to the elements, birds pecking, rain soaking, sun blistering. In winter, they froze. In summer, they dehydrated. But always, they were meant to be seen. Because visibility was the point. The wheel wasn't just about ending a life. It was about sending a message that echoed through town squares, markets, roadsides, that the law had teeth, that God was watching, that this is what happens to those who transgress, but who ended up on the wheel. Was it just the most depraved criminals, the unrepentant murderers? Not quite. In theory, the wheel was reserved for the most heinous offences: murder, arson, treason. But this was medieval justice. Remember, consistency wasn't the rule. Guilt wasn't always proven. And social status, it changed everything. A nobleman accused of treason might get a swift beheading. A beggar accused of theft. The wheel, wealth bought mercy, poverty bought pain. And that discrepancy wasn't accidental. It was systemic. Because the wheel didn't just punish, it reinforced the hierarchy. It reminded the lower classes not only of the power of the state, but of their place beneath it. And sometimes, crimes weren't even crimes at all. During periods of religious upheaval, heresy could be punished by the wheel, refusing to convert. Wheel, gossiping about a king. Wheel, dodging attacks at the wrong time. You get the idea. And once someone had a reputation, once they were known to the local authorities or disliked by the townsfolk, mere accusation could seal their fate. Trials were brief. Evidence was flimsy. Confessions extracted under torture were admissible. The result, a justice system where pain wasn't proof of guilt, it was often its substitute. Now let's descend even further into the psychology behind the spectacle. Because if the breaking wheel was only about punishment, it wouldn't have needed an audience, but it always had one. And not just any audience. This was a crowd that gathered weeks in advance, parents bringing children, nobles arriving with picnic baskets, vendors setting up stalls like it was a carnival. And in many ways, that's exactly what it was. Except the main attraction wasn't a juggler or a minstrel, it was someone's body being methodically, publicly destroyed in front of hundreds, sometimes thousands. And the applause didn't come after music, but after bones snapped audibly beneath iron. So we have to ask, what does it say about a society when watching torture is not only acceptable, but celebrated? In medieval Europe, public executions were the social glue that bound communities together in fear, in judgment, and in twisted camaraderie. They were equal parts moral theatre, entertainment, and warning. And if you think people only came out of obligation, think again. Because the details show us otherwise. Families arrived early to get good viewing spots. Wealthy spectators paid for elevated seats. Elaborate meals were unpacked. Children ate meat pies while watching men scream. And wagers were placed, yes. Actual betting, how long the victim would survive, which limb would break first, and what final words would be spoken, turning human agony into a sport that blurred the lines between cruelty and culture. And before we shake our heads in modern superiority, let's remember that today we still watch simulated violence for entertainment, binge on serial killer documentaries, and slow down at car crashes, not to help but to gawkward's. Changed is the packaging, not always the instinct. But in medieval times, there was no packaging, no filter, the suffering was real. The screams unscripted, the executioner a performer with a job both sacred and reviled. Because here's something few people realize. The executioner wasn't just some nameless brute swinging a club. He was a trained professional, part physician, part actor, part pariah, and his job wasn't just to kill it, was to do it correctly, which meant controlling the tempo of violence like a conductor leading a symphony of pain, and the wheel demanded finesse, not rage. An inexperienced executioner could botch a performance, break the wrong bone, kill too quickly, lose the crowd's attention, and that wasn't just embarrassing, it was dangerous, because the public wanted a show, and if they felt cheated, they might riot or turn on the officials. So executioners had to walk a razor's edge, deliver horror, but do it with precision. These men often came from families of executioners, the profession passed down like a cursed inheritance, and once you were marked, there was no going back. No one wanted to hire the butcher's son to run a bakery or teach school or marry into a merchant family. Executioners lived on the margins, sometimes literally, in houses built just outside town, walls banned from taverns, exiled from churches, excluded from social events, yet completely indispensable because no one else would do what they did. And the irony, they were paid extremely well. In fact, master executioners often earned more than blacksmiths or carpenters or even local officials, because breaking bones without killing someone took anatomical knowledge, physical control, and emotional detachment, all rare skills. They were the surgeons of state violence, operating not with scalpels, but with rods. And their work didn't end when the crowd dispersed. After the final breath was drawn, someone had to clean up, dismantle the wheel, drag the body down, clean the blood, dispose of the remains, sanitize the site for the next market day. Sometimes this cleanup was ignored, and the body stayed some bleached, fly-covered, grimly iconica, literal warning sign, nailed into the social consciousness. Other times, it was swept away like trash, because even in death, the condemned weren't given dignity. But let's rewind to before the wheel even turned, because the legal system that funneled people toward this fate was just as horrifying. Trials, if you could call them that, evidence requirements, almost non-existent. A rumor, a grudge, a poorly timed insult could spiral into an accusation, and once accused, the odds weren't in your favor. Confessions obtained under torture were admissible, and yes, you could be tortured before being tortured, an endless loop of pain designed not for truth, but for compliance. And the definition of crime was laughably broad by modern standards. Theft, yes. Murder, of course. But treason, that was the real catch-all. Because treason didn't just mean plotting against the crown, it meant saying something offensive about a noble, missing a tax payment during wartime, refusing to swear an oath, or just being in the wrong religion at the wrong time. Heresy was political. Politics was sacred. Everything was fluid except the outcome. And the less power you had, the more likely you were to find yourself tied to a wheel. Women were rarely sentenced to the wheel not because of mercy, but because it was believed they wouldn't survive long enough for the torture to be meaningful. See how twisted that logic is. The whole point of the wheel was prolonged agony, and if a woman was too weak to last through the performance, they'd just find a quicker way to kill her. And for men, especially the poor or already labeled as troublemakers, the sentence could come swiftly, arbitrarily, and with no recourse. But here's what's perhaps most chilling. For centuries, this system didn't just function, it thrived. Towns budgeted for it. Blacksmiths forged custom bars. Carpenters built specialty. Wheels, rope makers provided bindings. Municipal councils approved expenditures. There were expense reports, itemized costs, contracts. Torture wasn't barbaric chaos. It was bureaucracy. It was line items on a ledger. It was death by committee. Some towns even monetized it, further charging fees for premium viewing areas, selling food licenses to vendors, treating executions as events that could generate income. It wasn't just justice, it was business. And as gruesome as that sounds, it speaks to a larger truth about medieval life. Pain was public, death was communal, and violence was normalized. To suffer in secret was suspicious. To die in private was a missed opportunity. Public executions were where the community saw its values reinforced not in sermons, but in shattered limbs. And still, despite all the pain, all the screaming, all the bones shattered and twisted into the timber of the wheel, the question remains, why did it last so long? Why did this medieval monstrosity not fade away after a few generations, exposed for the cruelty it so obviously was? Why did it survive not as a forgotten anomaly, but as an institutionalized, carefully preserved form of execution for hundreds of years? The answer lies not just in power or tradition, but in fear. Because the breaking wheel wasn't just about punishing the guilty, it was about preventing anyone else from ever daring to cross the line, even accidentally, and fear is a powerful glue capable of binding societies together more tightly than love, law, or faith. And in medieval Europe, fear was woven into every part of life. Fear of sin, fear of the devil, fear of social collapse, fear of divine punishment, and fear of being next. The wheel represented a kind of secular crucifixion, less about atonement, more about warning, and it worked. People obeyed, they conformed, they silenced dissent. They turned their heads, or worse, they joined the crowd and cheered, because when the state displays its power through suffering, the safest place to be is in the audience. But there's a deeper layer here too, one we rarely explore when we talk about torture. It's not just about pain, it's about transformation. The condemned were turned from person into example, from citizen into symbol, from human being into myth, and the wheel was the tool that facilitated that alchemy. It turned flesh into metaphor. A man might steal out of desperation, but once on the wheel, he became a story, a cautionary tale, a lesson etched into collective memory. And that kind of power, the power to rewrite identity through pain, was intoxicating to those in charge. And so the wheel kept turning, not just in France or the Holy Roman Empire, but across the continent, adapted and reinterpreted by local authorities, modified in technique but never in intent. In some places, the wheel became ceremonial raised, on hills draped with banners, executed with choreographed steps and scripted prayers. In others, It remained raw and unfiltered, a matter-of-fact violence conducted on dirt platforms without pretense. But always, it served the same purpose: to teach. And this brings us to one of the most overlooked elements of the breaking wheel: its educational function. Yes, you heard that right. Education. In a time when books were rare, literacy was limited, and oral tradition was king, the wheel served as a visual textbook on power. Children were brought to watch executions not out of cruelty, but because parents believed it taught discipline. To see a man writhe, broken and bloodied, was to understand the cost of disobedience. To see the priest raise a cross as the hammer fell was to connect divine order with state authority. The lesson was simple: obey or suffer. And this lesson wasn't limited to the poor. Nobles attended, clergy attended, even royals watched from balconies. This wasn't a secret, sham, it was a public ritual. And for those whose job it was to perform this ritual, the executioners, it was a burden as much as a duty. We touched on this before, but it bears deeper examination. Imagine a profession that trains you to destroy bodies with precision, that requires you to understand human anatomy, not to heal but to hurt, and that punishes you socially for doing the very job you were hired to perform. This was the life of a professional executioner in medieval Europe. Many drank, some isolated, others developed strange superstitions, rituals to protect themselves from the evil they felt they were channeling. They washed obsessively. They buried bits of wood or cloth at crossroads. Some even sought out confession from priests who didn't want them, because while society needed executioners, it never forgave them. They were essential and exiled, and yet towns competed for the best ones. Skilled executioners were a status symbol. A botched executioner wheel that collapsed, a bar strike that killed too quickly, was humiliating to both town and torturer. There were stories of audiences booing when victims died too fast. Complaints were filed. Officials were shamed. In a world where justice was a performance, a poor performance was unacceptable, so precision was prized. The bar had to fall at just the right speed. The bone had to snap just so. The victim had to scream but not die. And this required more than strength. It required expertise. A master executioner understood physics. He studied previous cases. He adjusted for weight, limb position, weather. Wet wood reacted differently. Cold bones shattered faster. All of this was taken into account. And yet, for all their professionalism, these men were denied nearly every basic comfort. No taverns, no markets, no marriages outside their own caste. They lived among death, performed it for others, and were treated as though it might infect them, and in many ways it did. Their children inherited not just the profession, but the stigma. A son born to an executioner was often branded by association. Even if he never lifted a bar, he carried the social stain. And once branded, the only safe path was to become what people already believed you were. It was self-fulfilling damnation. And yet, some leaned in. They became famous. Their names whispered with awe and fear. They perfected techniques. They published guides. They became the trusted hands of the law. And that's the tragedy, isn't it? These were not madmen. They were craftsmen, warped by a system that made cruelty into an institution. But all systems strain eventually. And as Europe crept toward the Enlightenment, cracks began to show. Philosophers started asking difficult questions. What is justice? What is cruelty? Does torture actually prevent crime or just brutalize the public? Is suffering a deterrent or just a spectacle? And slowly the tide turned. Not everywhere at once, not without resistance. But the arguments began to resonate. Thinkers like Cesare Beccaria, in his seminal work on crimes and punishments, denounced torture as both ineffective and immoral. Courts began experimenting with alternative sentences. Towns started cutting costs, realizing that executions, especially elaborate ones like wheel breakings, were financial burdens, and the wheel, after centuries of turning, began to slow. And so we reach the slow unraveling, the long fade out of the breaking wheel knot, a dramatic collapse, not a revolution that stormed the gallows, but a quieter, colder death marked by silence, paperwork, and shifting values, because, in the end, it wasn't morality alone that broke the wheel, but also economics, philosophy, and the gradual realization that fear, while effective, was expensive, and expensive things must be justified, and the wheel crafted by skilled carpenters, outfitted with precision-forged iron bars, operated by highly paid executioners, surrounded by layers of ritual and cleanup simply stopped making financial sense, especially when simpler methods could achieve the same result without draining town budgets or risking the wrath of a restless crowd. And this, in many ways, is the most medieval irony of all. It wasn't compassion that killed the wheel, but cost efficiency. In Prussia, the legal abolishment of torture began in 1740 under Frederick the Great, a ruler more interested in Enlightenment logic than spectacle, and one by one, German states followed suit, with France dismantling most of its torture infrastructure during the French Revolution, when the people decided that perhaps it was time to turn the tools of terror back on those who had wielded them for so long. And by 1841, the final legal breaking wheel execution took place. Man convicted of multiple murders was sentenced, in Prussia, becoming the last official victim of a device that had outlived entire dynasties and ideologies, a grim bookend to an era defined by its willingness to make pain public and permanent. And even then, even as the wheel was pulled from town squares and carted off to rot in storage or burn in ceremonial bonfires, its echoes remain not just in memory, but in iconography, in the symbols etched into coats of arms, in the religious art that still bore its shape, and in the names of saints like Catherine, forever bound to a mythic wheel she never truly faced, but which became her emblem nonetheless. The breaking wheel didn't disappear, transformed, slipping from steel into symbol, from execution method into historical curiosity. Its spokes now silent, its bar no longer swinging, but its meaning lingering just beneath the surface of modern justice systems that still grapple with the ghosts of public punishment. And if we look closely, we can still see traces of its logic, the way modern institutions sometimes conflate punishment with deterrence, justice with performance, law with fear. We no longer wheel people in the streets, but we do still believe, in some corners of our society, that cruelty teaches lessons, that suffering creates order, that justice should not only be done, but be seen. But what the breaking wheel teaches us, if we dare to listen, is that the spectacle of suffering doesn't purify, it degrades. Not just the condemned, but the community. It poisons the bystander, numbs the child, corrupts the crowd. It trades humanity for control, and the wheel turned because we let it, because generation after generation rationalized that maybe this time it would work. Maybe this time the pain would prevent the next crime. Maybe this time the crowd would leave, more obedient. But it never truly worked that way. Yes, people feared. Yes, they watched. But they didn't become better. They became quieter. And silence is not civility. Silence is survival. And survival, in a world ruled by the wheel, meant playing along. Pretending the screams weren't unbearable. Pretending the blood wasn't staining the soul of the city. Pretending the children weren't watching, learning, absorbing the lie that justice must look like vengeance. But not everyone played along forever. As Enlightenment thinkers gained ground, as voices of reason pushed against centuries of tradition, a new idea emerged, that the value of justice lies not in its severity, but in its fairness, its consistency, its restraint. And slowly, this idea caught fire. Not everywhere, not all at once, but enough. And the wheel, once so deeply embedded in the rituals of death, found itself out of place in a world that was beginning to imagine punishment without cruelty, order without terror. And yet, even in its death, the wheel has something to teach us. It teaches us about power, how it is performed, how it is protected, how it is perpetuated through fear. It teaches us about society, what we accept when we're afraid, what we celebrate when we're conditioned, what we justify when we believe it keeps us safe. And it teaches us about history, not just the facts, but the psychology, the structure, the logic that made something so unthinkable seem not only normal, but necessary. The wheel wasn't some medieval fluke. It was a mirror, a reflection of what people will do when they believe that suffering is sacred, when pain becomes policy, and when justice loses its humanity in the pursuit of obedience. And perhaps that's why it's so important to remember the wheel, not to gawk at its gore, but to study its function. Because in every era, in every culture, there's always a temptation to return to fear, to believe that public pain will purify, that cruelty will restore order. But history tells us otherwise. History shows us that the more we celebrate suffering, the more we erode our own morality, until we forget not only how to forgive, but how to see each other as human. The wheel is gone, but the impulse it embodied is not. It lives on in how we treat the accused, in how we design our prisons, in how we talk about justice. And so the real challenge is not just to condemn the wheel, but to interrogate the systems we live in now. Are they built to restore or to break? Do they uplift the broken or display them? Do we still believe, deep down, that some people deserve to be twisted into warnings? If so, then the wheel may be gone, but its spirit still turns, and it's our job, yours and mine, to stop it. So now that we've traveled through centuries of cruelty, through cobblestone squares echoing with screams, through splintered wood and shattered bones, and generations that watched it all without flinching, ask yourself this: what does it really mean to build a justice system? Because at its core, justice isn't about blood or fear or control. It's about trust, about balance, about drawing a line between punishment and vengeance, between accountability and abuse. The breaking wheel didn't blur that line, it erased it. And what's most terrifying is not the violence itself, but how ordinary it became, how towns budgeted for it, how parents normalized it, how crowds cheered for it. This wasn't evil in secret, it was evil in plain sight, institutionalized, ritualized, and made sacred under the illusion of order. But history is a teacher that never stops whispering, and its lessons are as urgent now as they were when the first bone cracked under iron. It tells us to question not just how justice is delivered, but who gets to define it. It warns us that the moment we accept suffering as necessary, we begin to lose our grip on humanity. And it asks us, begs us not, just to look away from past horrors, but to look closer at what allowed them to flourish. Because the wheel didn't turn itself. It turned because people made it turn out of fear, out of habit, out of the terrible belief that pain purifies and punishment equals peace. But if there's one truth we must carry forward, it's this: cruelty never civilizes. It brutalizes. It spreads. It teaches silence where there should be resistance, obedience where there should be questioning, spectacle where there should be reflection. The breaking wheel was one of the darkest inventions of human imagination, but the real horror wasn't its construction. It was its approval. So remember it, not because it's entertaining, but because it's instructive. Remember it every time you hear someone say, "We should bring back harsher punishments." Remember it every time justice is turned into theater. And remember it every time suffering is sold as solution. Because the more we forget the wheel, the more likely we are to rebuild it in new forms, in new language, under new laws. So let the wheel stay buried, not just beneath history, but beneath vigilance, beneath compassion, beneath the unshakable belief that no society is just if it needs pain to keep order. Justice is not about breaking people. It's about building something better after they've fallen.